Good afternoon and most welcome everyone to today's seminar, regrettably the last of this fall semester, to be held by Peter Mancina on the topic of governance after the end of borders. We are delighted to have you here, Peter. Peter received his Ph.D. in Anthropology from Vanderbilt University in 2016. He's research associate at the Center for Criminology at the University of Oxford. And here at the Swedish Collegium, Peter is working on his book, Sanctuary City in the Age of Mass Deportation, which examines 3 decades of governmental experiments with sanctuary city protocols in the city of San Francisco, California. His research is based on ethnographic fieldwork and archival analysis examining how sanctuary city policies, as it were, in the United States empower local law enforcement agents to help deport individuals convicted of crimes. And his research in general speaks of highly topical yet also very classical themes in social anthropology and in social science more broadly. It speaks about human undocumented mobility, transnational refugee flows, the governance challenges of national states and public agencies, the role of citizenship, and the contestation of national borders. Prior to his work on sanctuary policies, Peter Mancina conducted transnational ethnographic fieldwork with Quetzal Maya farmers in Chiapas, Mexico, and in San Francisco, California, to examine the effect of their immigration and US day labor incomes upon development and politics in their towns of origin in Mexico. And his publications also reflect these interests. He is, for example, the author of the article Investigating and Not Disciplining Violations of Sanctuary Laws, published in the Southern California Interdisciplinary Law Journal this year. And he's the author of the article, The Crisis Management, Quetzal Maya Transnational Migration and the Foucauldian Apparatus, published in the Journal of Dialectical Anthropology in 2011. He has, apart from publishing strictly academically, also recently authored a public policy implementation report, Turning the Golden State into a Sanctuary State, a report on the impact and implementation of the California Values Act. This one describes how local law enforcement in California is continuing to assist in deportations despite the new state sanctuary law's extensive prohibitions on such activities. So it's with great anticipation, Peter, that I would like to present the stage to you to talk on the topic of governance after the end of borders. Most welcome.
Thanks so much, Christina. Thanks for inviting me to be here this fall semester. It's been really wonderful meeting all the fellows and meeting other members of the university community. Today I'm going to talk about what we can learn about governance in a hypothetical world without borders from what are called sanctuary cities in the United States. In a minute I'll get into what a sanctuary city is as I see it. For now I want to talk about the global context that leads me to even want to talk about borderless governance in the first place. Today we are living in an era of unprecedented human mobility. Movement inside of nations and across national borders, both legally and illegally, unauthorized and authorized, within the gaze of states and their border surveillance infrastructures, as well as in places that are not seen or patrolled by frontier border control agencies. People choose to leave their homes due to economic and political devastation and in search of economic and political opportunity. People flee war zones and environmental disasters. Many seek to reunite with family who have themselves migrated across borders, and others are pioneers who move to create a better, safer life for themselves and their families or communities back home. Others are forced to migrate because their nation has stripped them of their citizenship and recognizes them as foreigners in their own land, subjecting them to state violence. There are over 271 million international migrants living in countries throughout the world today. There are 28.7 million refugees and 3.5 million asylum seekers, many who are undocumented and awaiting asylum status determinations. There are also a very large group of migrants throughout the world who cross borders without legal documentation or authorization to enter a national territory. We do not know with precision how many exactly, it's very hard to determine that, but nations make estimates as to the amount of undocumented people within their own borders pretty frequently. In the US, there are an estimated 10.5 million unauthorized, undocumented immigrants in the United States. In Europe, there are an estimated 4.8 million undocumented immigrants. In India, at least 10 million. In Pakistan, at least 4 million undocumented immigrants. There is also a degree of mobility internal to nations. Internally displaced people who are forced to leave because of some form of violence or war, as well as environmental disasters. In 2018, there were 28 million internally displaced people throughout the globe, 10.8 million due to violence and 17.2 million due to environmental disasters. At the same time that we're seeing increases in global mobility, we're also seeing that what is being described as the hardening of borders, the erection of border walls, of border barriers, of border fences of some form or another that are increasingly patrolled by militaries and military-style immigration control forces. Over the past 70 years, roughly 50 border barriers have been created. This map shows where. The red walls right here are external national borders, and the green walls are internal to nation states that usually mark off ghettoized areas. This map comes from the organization Migra Europe. This is not my own. With this hardening of borders, more people have been crossing national borders in places that are more dangerous in terms of the geographical terrain. And this year, the International Organization for Migration has documented almost 3,000 migrant fatalities, largely due to people going into places where there are not hardened borders, but they are very dangerous places to cross international borders. As a result of the militarization of borders and the violence of borders as measured in migrant fatalities, migrant and refugee rights movements have increasingly demanded an end to borders and nations as such, to increase the free and safe movement of all people, not just demanding immigrant rights within nation states. For instance, scholars Maple Raja and Nadia El-Shaarawy, in addition, have argued that we should begin to consider autonomous mass mobility that crosses borders in a way that's unauthorized, and in many instances in confrontation with military border police, as is what happened in Hungary in 2015 when Syrian refugees entered from the Balkan route, that we consider this as a form of material, as we consider this from a material practice perspective, we should consider this as a mobilization against borders as such. In this case, people actually began to chant "open the borders" when they were confronted by military police, which led Maple Raja and Nadia El-Shaarawy to begin to look at this as a social movement. It's interesting and also not far from the argument that Hungary makes, actually, that such mobility should be seen as against its national sovereignty and in defiance of its borders and of the European Schengen zone borders. However, given the relative porosity of national borders and border enforcement activity, nations have increasingly attempted to integrate immigration control into the operations of local, municipal, county, state, or regional law enforcement agencies, as well as in agencies of their welfare states. They not only want local police to identify undocumented immigrants who've made it into cities deep inside of the interior of the country, or jails to detain them and transfer them to federal immigration police, but they've also passed laws to condition the provisions of benefits and services that are administered by city and county governments, but which are paid for by federal governments on the basis of national citizenship. And they also will straight up go to social welfare agencies and ask them for information on immigrant benefits and service recipients, hoping to get location information such as where the person might live, where they might work, so that they can go target them, arrest them, detain them, and deport them. In the US, Our Interior Immigration Enforcement Agency is called ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. In the U.S., they are in charge of deporting people, and they are separate from local police, who in general do not have the legal authority or mandate to enforce immigration laws. They enforce criminal laws and assist with civil disputes and emergency situations at the local level, while ICE and also the Customs and Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, which police the borders of the country, are in charge of enforcing federal immigration law. However, the primary way that ICE detains and deports people now since 2008 has been through a program called the Secure Communities Program. Basically, when anybody is brought into a police station, they're booked on a crime, their fingerprints are taken. Normally what happens is that fingerprint is automatically sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigations for a national criminal background check. So if somebody committed a felony in Florida and then travels across state lines all the way to California and is booked on something else, then the local police in California can see that this person is wanted for something in Florida. Now, after Secure Communities has started in 2008, first under President Bush, then it was also continued under President Obama, and now it has been amped up under President Trump. Those fingerprints are automatically sent on the back end from FBI to ICE. And ICE then uses those fingerprints to check, is this person a citizen that we know about? Is this person an undocumented or legal immigrants that we know about because, for instance, they've been deported once? Or is this a person, an unknown person that they want to then go and talk to the local authorities to then get access to the jail or police station, interview that person, detain them, and deport them? They then fax this detainer form to local agencies asking the local detention facility either hold somebody until ICE can come and pick them up, or they ask them for information about when they're going to release them to the city, to the public. In which case, ICE would then arrive at the public release and try to effect an arrest, also usually on the premises of the local law enforcement agency. This is an incredibly effective way of identifying, detaining, and deporting people, because ICE doesn't really have to do that much identification work. They don't have to do investigatory work. They don't have to go to somebody's work or home, and they don't have to try to multiple attempts to arrest them. They basically just get a notification from the local jail saying we have somebody, and they're already in lockup. ICE just shows up and takes them. And it's important to know that since local law enforcement is not legally obligated to help deport people, it's not their mandate under a federal law, they can refuse to do this assistance. And they don't have to actually hold immigrants, and they don't have to tell ICE about when they're going to release somebody. To counter the mass-scale deportation dragnet programs like Secure Communities that incorporate local law enforcement assistance, cities in the United States have passed what are called sanctuary policies. Many cities have. These are a rather heterogeneous group of policies that most people define as anti-deportation policies, policies that are supposed to resist the federal government in some way. They aim to get localities out of the business of immigration enforcement or immigration control. While those might be the intentions of immigrant advocates who first draft the policies, through the policy making process where a local legislator champions the policy, tries to get the support of other legislators who are moderates, perhaps the mayor who's going to ultimately enforce the policy. And even when the mayor is in communication with agencies like ICE about the policies really become multivocalic. They have multiple intentions. They're often very contradictory in their aims and their objectives. So I don't actually like to think of them as anti-deportation policies or policies that largely just do anti-bordering work. As they're currently constructed, I rather choose to describe them as policies that clearly define when it's appropriate to assist immigration authorities in identifying, detaining, and deporting people, and when it is not. So it's figuring out what is the best way to link the local government according to the prerogatives of the local government, the best way to link the local government with the federal government. What is the best way for the city to even use the immigration enforcement apparatus of the federal government, when and how it wants to, and when does providing assistance undermine local objectives? So these are really about how localities can hold the hand of the federal government in a way that doesn't crush the city's hand. Some of these policies harken back to the 80s. and are policies that generally prohibit local government workers from expending government resources and personnel time to help identify people for the federal government and detain and transfer them to the federal government for deportation. But there's also a second wave of policies that began to be passed in 2011, 2012, that have also been sort of grouped into the sanctuary policy category, which I'd like to rather call detainer policies. These are policies that really target secure communities in these detainer forms that I showed you before. They're policies which are specifically about local jails and police departments and when they can respond to those detainers and help give information about when they're going to release somebody or whether they can respond to detaining somebody for ICE. But in both generations of these kinds of sanctuary policies, their primary target really is government conduct. Through the implementation of government management, government management attempts to discipline governmental workers. And by that I mean, not in a negative sense necessarily, but they try to form the conduct of their own governmental workers in a productive sense, not necessarily a punitive sense. They want to produce worker practices, dispositions, attitudes, mentalities in relation to how they interact with the federal government, around immigration enforcement, as well as how they interact with the public who seeks city and county services and benefits. They largely say that these policies the purpose of them is to foster the trust of immigrant communities, especially undocumented immigrant communities. That is, so if the police doesn't cooperate in deportations, that undocumented people would be more likely to come forward and provide information to the police about a crime they witnessed. They don't think that they're in threat of being deported if they say, I saw somebody steal something, for instance. But nonetheless, they really directly control the practices of government workers and only indirectly try to attempt to touch out the conduct of undocumented immigrants themselves, asking them to come forward with information. So in this sense, it's ultimately the state really working upon itself. This is a map of the biggest sanctuary cities in the United States. It really shows you that sanctuary has been, since the 80s, sort of not an underbelly, but a part of local governance. It's been a part of local governance actually for a very long time that people haven't really talked about. Not because it was supposed to be secret, but because it was sort of taken for granted way of doing things after a long period of organizing to get these policies implemented. In San Francisco, they have a sanctuary law that is part of its administrative code. And this affects not just the police, but every city and county department and agency. It was passed in 1989. As a law, it allows for an oversight agency to oversee compliance. It's called the Human Rights Commission. They can take complaints that some city worker has violated the law, and then they can work with the departments to actually bring the particular city agency into compliance with the law if they're in violation. It also places the discipline of violations in the hands largely of the department heads. So if somebody violates it, it's up to the chief of that department to make sure that the person is disciplined. It gets retrained, or if there's something put in their personnel file, that's up to the department head. And department heads in San Francisco are largely appointed by the mayor. So the mayor has a significant amount of power in making a sanctuary city work, a sanctuary city regime work. In 2006 in San Francisco, actually, the mayor required that all city departments have not only a citywide law, but also local department policies that translate the citywide law into real protocols of frontline workers. How exactly is a social worker going to interact with somebody without asking them about their social security number or their immigration status, or in a way that doesn't get them to, or that forbids them from helping deport the people who seek their services. This included drafting very specific protocols, not only for doing the sort of sanctuary side or the not deporting, but also doing the deporting work. 15,000 city and county employees were trained on these protocols. But this really, it didn't just come from the government, it didn't just come from the mayor or from the city legislators. It ultimately came from a social movement in the 1980s, a social movement called the Sanctuary Movement. It's consisted of Christian churches and convents, Jewish and Buddhist temples, as well as Quaker societies, coming to the aid of refugees fleeing wars in El Salvador and Guatemala in the early 80s. these are effectively proxy wars during the Cold War, wherein the United States was ultimately attempting to fight the Soviet Union by providing military aid to the governments of Guatemala and El Salvador to crush leftist revolutions and to stop the spread of communism in Latin America as they saw it. These governments were not only attacking rebel strongholds, but they were actually targeting potential civilian support bases of insurgency. So people who are non-aligned even, who they thought could potentially give aid to rebels. And by targeting these people, they displaced hundreds of thousands of people in Guatemala and El Salvador, many who came to the United States. When they came to the US, they were denied refugee status because the US government, they had a general policy of essentially only recognizing refugees as legal refugees who are coming from communist states that they were fighting, like Afghanistan. The sanctuary movement decided to help refugees cross the border into the US and find places to stay in their network of religious congregants, provided them access to social services and legal services, psychological counseling, education, work opportunities. They also publicized the situation of refugees to a broad audience by making public declarations that they were providing sanctuary to people, and they intervened in a political discourse about Central American wars that until that point had really been dominated by the US federal government. There was no indie media at that time, no Twitter or Facebook. There was the radio, there was the television, there was the newspaper, and those venues were dominated by the US government voice. So this was, what they would do is they would go in front of their churches effectively, have refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala masked, who they were about to take into their some kind of hiding, and they would, in front of television cameras, say, we're taking this person in defiance of federal law, effectively. We dare the INS to come in and violate the sanctuary of our churches. And while we're here, here's what's happening in Central America. There's bombing going on in the rural countryside in places where they're not surgical strikes, they're mass, whole-scale slaughters of civilians. So they use this practice as a platform to talk about the wars, to stop wars, and to recognize these refugees as legitimate legal refugees. In San Francisco, they organized protests against the wars and U.S. involvement. They talked to media frequently. They got local legislators to pass legislation, mostly resolutions that were against the wars. And resolutions are largely just statements of value, of a city's values. They're not any kind of they're not kind of any disciplinary tool. They're mostly to say, we support the refugees, we are against the war. In 1985, movement organizers, some who were employed by the San Francisco Catholic Archdiocese, and others who were priests and nuns, led a grassroots campaign to pass the city's first sanctuary policy, which again was not a law, but a resolution. They had heard that the local sheriff, Michael Hennessy, at the time, was allowing the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was, before ICE, the INS was the deportation apparatus. ICE came after September 11th, 2001, when the Department of Homeland Security was created. ICE took up the role of deporting people from the interior of the country. At that time, the INS would go to the local jail and ask the sheriff, let me see all your roster of all your inmates. They would scan the roster for Latino names and would say, I want to talk to this person, this person, this person, this person, and the sheriff would just let them. And then they would interview them, take them into detention, and deport them. Many cases were documented by organizations in El Salvador and Guatemala that people, when they got back to the airport after they were deported, they were being shot, or they were taken from the airport, and on the road from the airport to the capital, they were shot and dumped. Their bodies were dumped along the road. So with sanctuary members hearing about this from their counterparts in Latin America, they wanted to stop the city involvement in these deportations, in addition to addressing the federal government. So they wanted to really pass a resolution. They worked with local legislatures to pass the City of Refuge resolution to make it basic a culture of government, not necessarily an effective policy, but a culture of government to not share information with the INS about refugees from Guatemala and El Salvador who are in their jails. It also would signal from the mayor who signed the resolution saying that we do not want local agencies discriminating against people on the basis of their immigration status. So it was the first real in a way, cultural implementation of a form of post-national governance within the context of a city and state and nation state and this movement, I want to say, it was not attacking borders as such. There was no real critique of the nation state as an entity or of borders. It was really they were trying to stop deportations and get legal status for these refugees. But in doing this, in instituting this, it started the germination of a different kind of governance that disregards national citizenship and tries to govern people as residents regardless of immigration status. After 4 years of police complaining about this resolution and after they violated the intentions of the legislators in making this resolution, they cooperated, for instance, with the INS in a raid in 1989 of a salsa club that was actually frequented by a lot of city officials. It really made the city officials mad, the Latino city officials mad, because they weren't going to Irish pubs in the north part of the city where there were also a lot of undocumented Irish immigrants. They were specifically going to black and brown communities and targeting immigrants there. In 1989, they decided to turn the resolution into a city law that was part of its administrative code that could be used to discipline employees, that could be enforced by the mayor. And at the time, Mayor Art Agnos, he was actually a close friend of Father Peter Salmon. So this is Art Agnos here. That's Art Agnos, and that's Peter Salmon. He was a leader of the sanctuary movement, one of the sort of figureheads of the movement in San Francisco, and he was a mayor. While he was a state assembly member before he became mayor, Father Peter Salmon had brought him down to El Salvador in a sort of conversion process, the way that they did with a lot of sanctuary movement activists, to witness firsthand what it was like in the countryside where bombings were happening, where the US government was saying there wasn't no bombings. Salmon brought Mayor Agnos to see people in jails who were being tortured and to witness, to listen to the bombings in the countryside. It really transformed his view of what was going on. And when he became mayor, and after this law was passed in '89, he appointed Salmon to become the watchdog of the law. So actually, a sanctuary activist became a government official, in a sense, overseeing the implementation of this law. So when instituting this policy, they really turned sanctuary movement practices of resistance to city-assisted deportations into governmental resistance towards city-assisted deportations. In effect, movement resistance was transformed into managerial discipline and punishment of their own workers. Discipline in the form of training on new protocols and punishment for violations of those protocols. From the city's perspective, they were no longer just governing national citizens, of course. If they were to prohibit their employees from asking about immigration or citizenship status, or from conditioning their services and benefits to people on the basis of national citizenship status, that would mean they really were attempting to govern a new kind of governmental subject, residents regardless of immigration status. However, there were caveats to this. Since they still administered federal benefits programs within the context of the nation state, they didn't really want to pay for absolutely every service and benefit that they were providing. So within the law, they actually allowed for local employees to continue to ask about immigration status from people who are coming for instance, food stamps or medical care. In hospitals, they could say, do you have a social security number? And if the person said no, they wouldn't record it and then report their name to the INS. What they would do is they'd say, okay, I'm going to put you into a city-funded healthcare program where we're going to subsidize your emergency medical benefits. So they were still allowed to make use of national citizenship, but not for the purpose of immigration enforcement. This is a picture of San Francisco General now. It's actually been revamped by Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, and it's probably one of the most technologically advanced public health department and general hospital in the city. And functioning, like I say, in this manner where citizenship is still a part of it, but it need not necessarily be. However, a more problematic allowance for city and county employees, primarily in law enforcement, still ask about immigration status and even assist in deportations, came from two amendments to the law in '92 and '93. One allowed city and county law enforcement to assist federal immigration authorities if a person was either booked on a felony level crime, so they're brought into a jail, they're arrested, they have not seen a judge, they've not been found guilty, there's charges filed by the police, So they can report people who have been booked on felony charges, or people who might be booked on even a lower level charge, like a misdemeanor, but who have been convicted of a felony in the past. They were really defining, in this sense, who they wanted to help deport and who they didn't want to help deport. To implement these exceptions, which applied to both adults and juveniles, the Juvenile Probation Department and the Police Department had to elaborate real on-the-ground protocols for every one of their units as to how, specifically how those workers were going to help communicate information about immigrants to ICE and the INS before them, to detain people, and also to obtain reasonable suspicion that particular people were undocumented. So they didn't have to necessarily report everyone booked on a felony, but only people who they thought might be undocumented. And you can imagine what would happen when you give local law enforcement a wide range of choices as to how they would determine that. Are you white? Are you brown? Are you speaking Spanish, for instance? Are you wearing a particular kind of clothing? There was one actual determinant that was, were you arrested in an area with a lot of undocumented immigrants? Which in a place like San Francisco is pretty laughable, because there's about upwards of 40% of the population is foreign-born, or an estimate of 15 to 20% are undocumented. So every single neighborhood is a place where undocumented people either live or work. But it gave a wide range of flexibility for law enforcement to profile people. And I should be very clear that these particular protocols to help deport were really written in consultation with INS and ICE in the 90s and also later. They worked, the mayor's office, in fact, after these policies were first drafted, but before they were passed, the mayor's office, in all of these different phases of the law, they actually consulted INS and ICE to say, what do you think about these policies? And ICE would give them responses back saying, I think you should worry about this particular scenario, and you should build in these exceptions to allow your local police and local jails to still help give us people. And the mayor followed their direction and pushed back on the more progressive legislators who were backed by the immigrant community. And they really built these exceptions into the law. That's where these came from law enforcement and from ICE itself. So the media would really like everyone to believe, and also President Trump would like everyone to believe, that sanctuary policies are an entirely local effort, that they're resistance policies, but in actuality, ICE has had a large hand in creating these policies as well. They are cooperative policies, cooperatively produced policies. So for this reason, I really view sanctuary cities truly, as they're currently elaborated, as pro-immigrant and in many ways post-national deportation machines that use the federal government to exclude certain people it doesn't want, not on the basis of immigration status in all cases, but primarily on the basis of their criminal past or their criminal present. Geographer Saren Houston has pointed out that through these exceptions, sanctuary policies reify a neoliberal framework that treats law-abiding immigrants as a model minority, as an asset to the city economy worthy of protection, as good, hardworking, self-starting individuals, as economically valuable. It emphasizes their contributions as tax-paying contributors who uphold quality morals, in contrast to criminal immigrants who are undeserving of sanctuary protections. These are the immigrants worthy of sanctuary, whereas people who are accused of crimes are not welcome and even threaten the sanctuary city. The notion is that in order to safeguard the sanctuary, you have to deport the criminals. In actuality, getting police and sheriffs to deport people doesn't reduce crime rates in cities among the general population or among immigrant populations, contrary to what we might all believe. It just gives really the allure that the local Democrat politicians who are championing these policies are tough on crime, they're pro-immigrant, and this really insulates them from conservative arguments in elections. Conservative politicians and media for over 15 years have really targeted sanctuary cities on Fox News, on Breitbart, calling them illegal, unsafe, calling politicians that pass them or advocate for them as lawless or corrupt, branding advocates of them as the open borders lobby. When the people who have advocated for these laws and the Democrats who are championing these laws have really never, ever advocated for open borders until recently. For the past 30 years, it's really been about stopping deportations and providing a space of refuge for refugees. There's never really been a critique of borders and nations built into Sanctuary City until the radical right sort of started branding these people as open borders people. When Trump became president, well, first of all, in his campaign, he hired Breitbart's chief executive, who knew all of the statistics about how many people responded on Breitbart online to Sanctuary, all the kinds of comments that people were saying on the articles about Sanctuary on Breitbart, how it ignited people who felt disenfranchised in the United States about immigrants, people who are far away from immigrant communities, middle-class communities that were afraid of criminal immigrants. And immediately after he hired Bannon to be his chief strategist, or his campaign manager, immediately that week he went to Arizona and started talking about how he was going to end sanctuary cities. It was a very direct relation to hiring Steve Bannon to talking about sanctuary cities. And at that moment, it really started, it brought sanctuary cities to the national stage, to presidential politics. It made it a national issue. And he campaigned on this notion that I'm going to end sanctuary cities. When he first got into office in January, one of his first executive orders was to end sanctuary cities by defunding them of their federal funds. That was his idea, that he would just starve them of federal funds, and that would make local officials say, we need this money, we're going to change our sanctuary policies. I won't get into the legal battles about this, but he has lost big time on this. The cities took him to court, and basically he does not have the executive authority to do that. They've put an injunction on this executive order, but it did nonetheless have an effect. Lots of states brought to their state legislatures anti-sanctuary laws, including Texas, which passed SB 4, which outlawed sanctuary cities, placed a monetary amount violations on anybody who implements a sanctuary city for even a day. It's, I think, about $5,000 per day if you implement a sanctuary law, and you can be put in jail if you're a sheriff or a local law enforcement official who has a sanctuary policy. So that was Texas's law. But actually more powerful, what Trump did was he made sanctuary balloon throughout the country. People adopted sanctuary policies all over the country. In his first year, over 400 new localities which did not previously have sanctuary policies passed them. Knowing also that he was being defeated on them, that the legality of sanctuary cities, that they are legal, that local governments do have the local authority to direct their local resources in policing in certain ways, and that they're not required to do immigration policing, that they should not be using their money to detain and deport people, that they have the legal authority to do that, and that Trump's efforts were overstepping his bounds. People, once they started finding out about that, they said, we don't want to help and deport, we don't want to spend our money deporting, we don't want immigrant communities being afraid of us. And so actually what Trump effectively did was he gave voice to sanctuary at the national stage and spread it like wildfire. In California, the state passed a sanctuary state law that Christina referenced in my introduction, requiring all localities throughout California to elaborate policies and procedures along the lines of what I discussed in San Francisco. This is called the California Values Act, or SB 54. This required all localities which did not prior have these policies to also implement deportation protocols, as in all sanctuary policies. So in effect, like sanctuary policies turn local jurisdictions into pro-immigrant deportation machines that are also partly post-national, this turned all of California into that. In terms of absolute numbers of immigrants who were detained by local law enforcement in the first 6 months after the California state law passed, we do see numbers drop from local jails. So actually it did have an effect on reducing deportations, which was the intention of the people who wrote the law. But it also normalized over 400 deportations that local jails assisted in as normal, as reasonable, as sanctuary sanctioned deportations. By comparison with Texas, which now has outlawed sanctuary cities under SB 4, California in the same period deported far fewer immigrants from January through May than Texas did. So sanctuary policies do have a reducing effect, but nonetheless, as I say, it still maintains that level of 400 per month as something that we need. And what's interesting to me also about what's happening with sanctuary right now, sanctuary law at the governmental level, is that despite all of this deportation work, what's happening, because the national narrative about it is that there's these resistance cities, a lot of people are saying what we need really is sanctuary everywhere. We need sanctuary at the global level. And it's becoming intertwined with the narrative about no borders, about no nations. It's social movements as well are more and more turning to the demand for a world without borders, or the less radical version of a world with open borders. Oops. And actually, what's incredibly interesting to me is that despite the current manifestation of sanctuary cities that operationalize these deportation protocols and sort of mask them through this pro-immigrant discourse, we can easily imagine sanctuary cities without them. They don't need these policy exceptions, these carve-outs is what they call them. They're actually not necessary. They're entirely political. They don't actually make cities safer. And if we could imagine what that kind of government without those exceptions would be, we could see one that looks very similar to what San Francisco's government agencies look like now in all of its non-deportation aspects. They've set up a city and county funded system that does not require national citizenship, formal national citizenship in many cases. And in many kinds of interactions with government agents and the public, it doesn't even require that you be a local resident to operate. So they've effectively turned national citizenship into a factor that in most cases is irrelevant for their work. So for instance, if you're a victim or witness to crime, you do not need to be a city resident or a national citizen of the United States to talk to the police and provide information. They will still talk to you. So they're not just governing residents regardless of immigration status, they're governing people regardless of immigration status. You can even testify in court, for instance. Now there are some things, of course, that you can only be a resident to get. For instance, to put your child in a public school, you have to be a resident of San Francisco, but you can be undocumented. You don't need to be a national citizen of the United States. Now the city is wealthy. You might ask, okay, so for the small countries, this is going to, if we had a borderless world, people would just flood in and they would overwhelm the welfare state. San Francisco is a very wealthy city. It has a revenue base of over $10 billion. About $1 billion comes from the federal government, about $500 million from the state of California. But the rest is locally generated. So that's, $8.5 billion comes from San Francisco and their residents, from businesses. So this could indicate that if there were no nations or borders, and if cities like this governed populations, mobile populations, regardless of their place of origin, their mode of migration, entrance into the municipal jurisdiction, that cities like this could potentially exponentially grow along with their revenue base. And smaller towns and cities that did not have the same funds to provide government services to all would likely dry up and die. So there could be a sort of even greater hierarchy, a centrality of power within these mega cities without borders. And I'll just point out something, just to explain something here. So this is charges for services right here, the biggest source of revenue. This money comes largely from what are called enterprise institutions, which within the government. So they divide it between enterprise and government activities. Enterprise organizations are effectively like the public transit system. They are the port, the water management system, hospitals, the power grid. These are things that run like a business. Consumers pay into these public utilities or public services, and then they immediately use those revenues for the expenses. So it's sort of it's a all in-house economy. It's not like government operations where there's a government fund that comes from taxes largely and is used to fund services and benefits that they don't charge people for. However, there's also a cautionary tale to be told here that with all of San Francisco's unbordering practices, or practices which disregard the use of national citizenship, it will still exclude for sure some categories of people. And in a borderless world, or a world without nations, it might very likely be that while they no longer police people on the basis of immigration status, they nonetheless still police them and exclude them on the basis of criminality. San Francisco is the fourth most surveyed city in the United States, with one surveillance camera for every 3 residents. The district attorney makes use of footage from 2,753 cameras throughout the city when prosecuting crimes. And these cameras, as you can imagine, are focused in tourist areas, in low-income neighborhoods, and neighborhoods with large homeless populations. So they're focused in, for instance, the Embarcadero area here, they're in North Beach and the pier. This is Union Square, which is a tourist area. And they're also in places like Russian Hill here. Immigrant neighborhoods like Chinatown up here, the Mission District, which is the Latino and some Asian immigrant community here. This is a very low-income African-American neighborhood called the Bayview Hunters Point. This is the area where cameras exist. They're policing the poor and people who they suspect will commit crimes. There has been a recent law passed that I wanted to mention briefly before I end, in May of this year, outlawing the use of facial recognition technologies to police the public, which is good news, but the structure of governance in sanctuary cities is interesting in that we could still say it's a more complete system of control than cities that do not have sanctuary cities. It's a system which effectively solicits the participation of all people who are there, not just the national citizens. It is an efficient system that brings undocumented people out of the shadows and into the programs of government, providing information that the government needs to control the territory, to keep crime down, to manage public safety, to public health issues. They want all of the people there to participate in government. They want to give information. They want to get information also from undocumented visitors. Like I said, it's not just about residents of the city. They want undocumented people in general to come and cooperate and talk to the government, so that their governance is more effective, even when borders are completely traversed, undermined, when people are coming who they don't know where they came from and they don't have adequate forms of identification that the police can use. Coupled with a city like San Francisco, right next door to Silicon Valley, the heart of computer corporations, high tech, and also lobbyists who are from the tech industry who are working directly with local government to infuse government, like schools, databases, with technologies from these companies like Salesforce, Google, these kinds of companies working in tandem with law enforcement. Also, I should mention Palantir, which is a company in South Bay that has worked with the federal government to help identify Muslims and a variety of undocumented populations by integrating so many different kinds of social media and law enforcement databases into one interface. With companies like that, in conjunction with a totalizing system like Sanctuary City, that incorporates the notion of undocumented mobility, cities have the potential to become borderless police states. And likely, in that kind of a global scenario, different exclusions, which we might not know about now, but also many that we can assume will be the basis of exclusion, like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, or religion, might be all the more intensified. So on that cheery note, I'm going to end. Thank you very much.